Yeah, you guys are so lucky. I record everything for you. Jeez, that's why no one comes to class anymore. So today we're going to talk more about aid. Last class we looked at the institutions that play a large role in providing aid money and devising projects and funding projects and overseeing projects around the world. And today we're talking about some of the theories and problems around the whole idea of giving out aid. So, first, an announcement you probably saw on the website. The person I was going to get to give the guest lecture on November 21st, Dr. Ziad Khatib, who's a fascinating guy. He's worked in Sweden and the Middle East, all over the place. He's actually coming earlier to Ottawa. So instead, he will be giving his lecture on October 31st. So that class is no longer canceled. Hopefully somebody still comes to hear him speak. And the YouTube videos are instead moved to November 21st. Good. You all look so happy about that, right? Good. You get some. Yes. Yes, on the 21st. That's attached to the film, right? So it'll be released automatically by the website on that day. Okay, cool. Any questions? So that's the same weekend that the CSIH is having their big global health conference, which is why Ziad is in town. Is anyone planning on attending that conference? Any chance? I know some people had asked about it. It costs money to attend, unfortunately. I got to remember this is being recorded, but I'll say it anyway. Try to sneak in. If you don't want to pay, just show up and see if you can sneak in. They haven't got enough money to pay for security, so just go, all right? Education comes before obeying the law. All right, let's begin. So I got a couple of newspaper clips to show you. It's from 2009. Globe and Mail, a secret Mali deal to release 2 Canadians. Canada's aid to Mali was increased sharply in recent years. Okay, what happened here is that aid was being used as a leverage for allowing a diplomatic task to take place. In other words, the freedom of diplomats was allowed by manipulating aid somewhat to this particular country. So is aid simply a humanitarian response, or is it a leveraging tool for diplomatic activities? Ex-envoy urges government to abolish CETA. Remember, CETA used to be the Canadian International Development Agency. Now it's part of Global Affairs Canada. It used to be our ministerial body to deal with international development. And here we have someone saying it's got to go. Right? He's saying it should be abolished because all we're doing is funneling money into countries, and that money is never seen again. So there's an inefficiency complication, he would argue. That still exists, he would probably argue today, even though it's under global affairs and not a parliamentary ministry unto itself. Feds looking for new aid projects. So this is back during the Harper years, when they decided to set aside a large amount of money, $1 billion, as part of the, what's called the, what's it called again? Muskoka Initiative. So $1 billion was set aside for maternal and child health care. So that was a billion Canadian tax dollars set aside for aid projects. And on top of it them being an altruistic endeavor, saying we're going to help the world, this was done as a marketing tool to show how generous Canada is, and it was going to be sent to countries in which there was some strategic advantage to be gained. Ethiopia using Canadian aid as a political weapon, the rights group say. So there's here we have reports that the Ethiopian government is accepting Canadian aid, then disbursing that aid according to its own internal political needs. So again, what is the purpose of aid? Is it to help people? Is it to affect political change, or is it to empower other kinds of people to affect political change? It's complicated. Canada suspends health aid to Zambia, not Nambia, as Donald Trump would say. Did you hear about that? Donald Trump made up a country called Nambia, right? So was he thinking of Zambia or Narnia or some combination? So Narnia plus Nambia plus Zambia equals Nambia. So we found out that somebody in Zambia's health ministry was embezzling millions of dollars, and so we suspended our aid program. Now, that some people argue that that's the price of business, is that you accept there's going to be some theft, or a lot of this money will be taken and put into other kinds of purposes. Anytime you channel money from one place to another, along the way, everyone with whom it changes hands will take their piece, to the point where there's much less arriving at the destination. So sometimes that piece is taken by the consultants who stay right here in Canada. Sometimes it's taken by the multinationals that have to process various kinds of activities along the way, and sometimes it's straight out corruption, as it is here. I've seen some governments whose aid model is they will give a country a chunk of cash and then send an official with that money who sits in the ministry and watches how it's spent. And if they don't like how it's spent, then they don't get more money in the future. That's one way around it. Feds announce aid money for polio eradication. So you can target money for one particular task like this, polio eradication. In 2012, remember when the Arab Spring was happening and Egypt had overthrown their dictator and was moving towards democracy? The United States forgave $1 billion of debt that was owed to them by Egypt as a reward for their political change. So how could they afford to do this? Well, they have the money. So they maintain the debt as a way to keep in reserve a kind of political leverage to be used in times like this. Right? We'll forgive this debt if you do these things for us. And you can coerce countries to doing certain things in a variety of ways. You can threaten them with military destruction. You can threaten them with ostracization diplomatically. You can threaten them with withholding aid, or you can actually threaten them with not forgiving their debt. So again, debt forgiveness is a kind of aid also. And it costs the United States upfront nothing to do so. Just saying, we're never going to get this money anyway. Let's just say we forgive it. UN to ask Canada to increase foreign aid spending. So we'll go back to this at the end of today's lecture. We have a long-standing target of giving 0.7% of our national income towards aid efforts, and we never make that commitment. We're actually at 0.24% when this article was written. So the UN has asked us to meet our commitments. Okay, our aid goes to these countries. The larger the circle, the more aid is received in terms of something called ODA. We'll define ODA in a second. ODA is Official Development Assistance. That's the money officially spent by the government for things that we call aid projects, as opposed to money that you and I donate out of our pockets to the Red Cross. That's a different kind of aid. ODA is official taxpayer labeled or tagged dollars that the government decides is going to go to other countries for aid purposes. So Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, right? These kinds of places. And the two kinds of aid we like to think about, humanitarian and development. One is easy, the other is hard. One is the one that everyone talks about all the time because it's a casual, easy conversation, and the other is more complicated. Humanitarian aid is emergency relief. That's when an earthquake happens or a natural disaster and people need help right now. When I've given this lecture in the past, it's an easy topic to think about. Of course, you always send money when there's a hurricane or an earthquake or something like that. But now we have, the orange-haired mutant in the White House who doesn't even do that for humanitarian relief. So things are even changing on this front. But in general, if you were to ask the common person on the street, hey, there's a volcano erupted and this village is buried, should we help them? Well, of course we should, because no one is completely soulless. On the other hand, if you ask people, should we be spending money on improving women's rights in this particular country, or fighting female genital mutilation, or in a business development program, or to build a dam in that country over there, or to assist in water reclamation project. Those are development projects, and you'll find that maybe half the population feels, you know what, we have no business doing that. The people got themselves into that hole themselves, let them get themselves out. So one's an easy sell. Humanitarian aid is an easy sell. That's why on TV shows, whenever there's a character going off to do do-gooding work around the world, they're usually responding to humanitarian aid. It's an easy sell. Doctors Without Borders, it's relief work. There's suffering happening right now. It's acute, short-term. We can go and fix it. Development is a long-term, grueling, politically problematic process. With development, we're aiming to affect things like health, wealth, and other indicators of development, including human rights, education, and government stability, but not limited to those things. And there are two ways of giving this kind of aid, bilateral and multilateral. So bilateral simply means it's country to country. So our Ministry of Health interacts with another country's Minister of Health, or our Global Affairs Department sends funds or resources or expertise directly to another country. Multilateral aid is when it goes through an agency, an intermediary. What kind of intermediary? Well, we talked about them last week. The World Bank, IMF, places like that. Right? So the World Bank, that's multilateral. When CETA does stuff, it's usually bilateral. And by the way, CETA now, of course, is Global Affairs Canada. When the IMF does stuff, it's multilateral. And USAID is bilateral because these two are official arms of governments, and they interact directly with other governments. Now, the aid term is misleading. Why? Because aid can come in many ways. When you talk to the average person on the street, they'll assume, oh, it's our tax dollars being sent abroad. Well, as I noted already, aid can be debt forgiveness. That costs you nothing to forgive debt, but that can be an enormous amounts of aid. It can be loans. So we still count loans as aid. Should we? I'm not sure. Is the bank being generous when it gives you a student loan? No, they're not. They expect interest payment back. They're being dickheads, right? So sometimes aid comes in the form of military assistance, and we still count that in terms of dollar-based altruistic aid. So don't be misled by these terms. If we look at how much is multilateral, how much is bilateral, most of it is bilateral. Most of the aid happening in the world, OECD, who knows what OECD is? Nobody? Remember this term. OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, essentially the wealthy nations of the world. OECD nations are the wealthy nations. So anytime you look at Canada's stature in the world, you're always comparing them to other OECD nations. The recent PISA report that looked at how good our education system is compared to other OECD nations. Why compare ourselves to Somalia or Bangladesh, where the systems aren't great? It makes no sense. So we compare ourselves to Switzerland and France and Germany, where the wealth is high. So amongst OECD nations, most of the aid given is bilateral, government to government. And this is a percentage of this thing called ODA, which we'll get to in a second. So bilateral aid is, again, when we partner directly with another country. Sometimes we channel the actual activities through smaller groups, but there are official signatories between representatives of the donor and recipient nations. Multilateral aid goes through, again, World Bank, IMF, places like that. And some people will argue that the only kind of multilateral aid is World Bank or IMF, and there's no other kind of multilateral aid. I can't really argue with that much. I struggle to think of another organization that could accept large amounts of money, but I'm sure they must exist. So, ODA, Official Development Assistance. That's what we mean by foreign aid usually. Now that you've seen these words, you will see them all the time. When you read the paper, as I'm sure you do, and look at global affairs news, as I'm sure you will, you'll hear these terms, ODA. So GDP, of course, is a measurement of our wealth, gross domestic product. That's how much stuff we produce as part of our economy. It's the most common way of measuring the wealth of a nation. It's not the best way. It's not the only way. It's the most common way. It has its flaws. GNI is our gross national income. So it's not how much you make plus how much you make plus how much I make, all that stuff. What it is how much the state makes in terms of its debt repayments, its investments abroad, its bond payments, things like that. So, so it's GDP plus all the income it's getting from all sources. So these two are measurements of a nation's wealth, and this is how much a nation gives away in terms of aid. Now, there's private aid as well as remittances. So far, ODA is the kind of aid we've been talking about. ODA is when governments give money. Okay? That's the stuff that always happens in the media. Every election cycle, the candidates will talk about, well, we have to increase our ODA or decrease our ODA for conservatives, But the two other kinds of money flow that happens at a very large volume are private and remittance payments. So private aid is when you and I give money directly to a charity. As we will see, as I'm sure won't surprise you, the United States tends to be among the least generous nations when it comes to ODA. And we give them shit for that all the time. Right? The wealthiest nation in the history of humankind, yet you give the least amount of money. On the other hand, they give the most amount of money when it comes to private aid. So their citizens as individuals are a lot more generous than our citizens are. Their government is less generous than our government as a percentage. So there are pluses and minuses to that. If you're giving money as an individual, what are the pluses? Would you rather give money to the things you care about, or to have your government figure that out for you? Right? So if you're giving money, chances are it's the money you're giving is tied to your values. It probably goes through your church or the NGOs you care. Maybe I give money to Humane Society because screw people. I care about dogs, right? So I'd rather have all my money go to the Humane Society than to any human thing because I'm an asshole. Right? So these are the things that I care about. So with private aid, you can channel your money depending upon your personal values. On the other hand, those personal values can be problematic. So a lot of U.S. private aid goes through churches. So when churches have particular value-based agendas that may be in conflict with the larger state-based agenda. So churches tend not to give to sexual health programs, for example, or to needle exchange programs. They'll give to abstinence programs and things like that. So, there are pluses and minuses. Remittances are when money is sent back home by workers. So, some of you have been to the Gulf states, I'm sure. Right? So, who are the workers in the Gulf states? It's not the Arabs. Who's doing the manual labor in the Gulf states? Yeah? Yeah, but where are they from? Philippines? Some are, and some are where? Yeah, East Africans, South Asians, and Southeast Asians mostly. The largest visible group is probably the South Asians, so from South India. In fact, Keralans, people from the Indian state of Kerala, constitute a very strong percentage of manual laborers in the Gulf states, and after 9/11 they were actually hit hard because they were sent back home. But those individuals send a hell of a lot of money back home to the countries they came from. Those are remittance payments. So those aren't sent by governments, they're not sent by NGOs, they're not donations given by wealthy citizens. Those are hardworking people who are sending their salaries back to their husbands and wives and children back home. And the World Bank estimates that's like over $1 billion per year is remittance payments alone. And that's only counting the large ones coming out of the Gulf states and places like that. But we all do it. Like, if you're an adult working, you probably send money to your parents at some point if they're retired, that kind of stuff. That's all remittance payments. That's a real thing. And there are pluses and minuses there too that you're going to see. So private aid is free from a government political agenda, but reflects a personal agenda. Pluses and minuses. Remittance payments might have a negative effect. Because the negative effect seems to be this. I'm not sure this is true, but this is the argument. If you're sending money back home to your family, that money stays in the family and doesn't necessarily enter the larger economy. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't do so on a scale you might expect. If I were to donate money as a state to a particular struggling economy, I would be strategic in that I would spend money on a school, on a highway, on a dam or something. If it's just money sent back by workers, it's going to stay in this place. I'm going to build a really big house, a big fence, get a dog for my family. It's going to stay right there, maybe send my kid to school in England or something like that. So the money tends to be concentrated. On the other hand, I mentioned before the miracle of Kerala. So Kerala, the state in India, in the southeast portion of India, is a communist state that has been, for a long time, put forward as an example of the miracle of development. They have a 100% literacy rate. Women and men have equal amounts of literacy, equal employment rates. There's low amounts of violence there. It seems to be something resembling almost a development paradise, and no one's quite sure how they did it. It's got some issues. But one of the things that worked out for them was they had so many workers in the Gulf states sending money back. We think those remittance payments funded the Kerala development revolution. So, money. There are lots and lots of different types of aid. We could go through scores of examples. I won't go through all of these, but we have project aid. That's when we give money specifically for a task, like building a school or a highway, or to pick a program. We can give money so that a nation isn't going broke. Saying you have a massive debt load, here's some money to resolve your debt load slightly. It's not going to be spent in projects. It's just going to be there for so your budget doesn't collapse. We can say food aid. So food aid's a big deal. Food aid can be actual food that's being sent in the case of a famine, which is what it usually is, or it can be money sent to buy food in the case of a famine. Then there's tied versus untied aid, and these are important to understand. Right? So tied aid means I'm going to give you this money, but it's tied to certain conditionalities. Those conditionalities usually are you must spend this money in a certain way on certain products made by certain people. Untied aid means here's the money, use it as you will. We'll get back to tied, untied aid in a second. So I mentioned a lot of aid comes in the form of military assistance, and this is problematic when it comes to understanding the volume of aid and assistance being given. So here's some data. Between these years, the U.S. gave Israel an average about $3 billion of aid, but it's almost all in the form of military aid. If it's not actual military equipment, it's money that's been earmarked for the purchase of military equipment. Who do they buy it from? They buy it back from the Americans. So it's not so much from giving you this money. I'm giving that money that you're going to spend on my products. So in other words, the money kind of stays here anyway. It's a zero loss strategy. And in 2010, billions were sent to Pakistan by USAIDs, by a development agency for economic development, but the military sent them $2.5 billion. So in fact, they get more in terms of military support than they do in aid support. But they will report a $4 billion investment, so they conflate the two. And the media sees that, and people see that, oh, we're giving Pakistan all this money. No, you're giving them weapons, and a lot of that is actually weapons in the form of loans to buy weapons. So it can be misleading. It's important to disentangle how this all works. So this looks at private aid versus ODA as percentage of GNI. So if you look at countries that don't give a hell of a lot of official aid but give a lot of private aid, unsurprisingly, the U.S. is number one. So their citizens give a lot individually, but the government doesn't give a whole lot. Denmark, their citizens don't give a lot, but their governments give a lot. Where's Canada? We're over here. We're actually not. We're kind of similar to the USA on a global scale. Our governments aren't as generous as, say, Scandinavian countries and European countries, and our citizens are almost as generous as the Americans, but not quite. So, private aid, as I mentioned, comes with agendas and things like that. So, tied versus untied aid. Tied aid, again, is when we say you must spend this money on certain products. And the story I gave a long time ago was in Guyana on the $6 million project that you all kindly paid for. Thank you very much. We had originally planned on wiring the entire nation as a health information system. And we were going to use open access materials, Apache servers, Linux servers, all that stuff in order to make it affordable. But then when the Americans showed up with PEPFAR money, everything had to become tied overnight. As a result, we could only buy from American servers and European and American drug suppliers, and so our prices went up dramatically. So in other words, tied aid is when a donor country gives money to the recipient, but stipulates that the recipient only buys goods and services from the donor. In other words, I'm saying, yes, I'm being generous. I'm giving you all this money, but you can only buy stuff with that money from me. It's self-serving. One could argue that it should be self-serving. One could argue that if I'm going to be generous, I should get something back from it. So that's the two arguments to be had about this. Or one could argue that if I'm going to be altruistic, I should be altruistic and leave things untied. Use the money as you will. Okay? It's kind of like if you see a homeless person on the street, you can give them money, or you can say, I'll give this money only if you buy the thing that I want you to buy with it. So that's the larger ethical discussion. Do you get upset if the homeless person buys alcohol? Some people do, some people don't. Okay? That's your choice. Yes?
We want to talk about why we can't be like Scandinavian countries in terms of giving that money from the government rather than...
It's a cultural choice. Government giving versus private giving, is that the question? Yeah, it's a cultural choice. And well, at the end of the lecture today, we'll talk about Canada's history of giving ODAs and how we're not reaching that 0.7% goal. But there's something about Scandinavian countries who feel that this should be a concerted, organized effort, and that individual desire is secondary to the overall goal of doing altruism at an organized level. Whereas the Americans, as you know, are big on individualism. That's why they got a gun issue. They believe that their right to remain armed trumps their desire to be safe. So these are individual belief systems. People are different. I'm not saying which one's better or worse. That's for you to decide. But you can always lobby your government to change path if you so desire. Moving on. So of all bilateral aid given 2006, was the last time I saw this data, only 41%, so less than half, is untied. So most aid given is in fact tied. Right? So again, don't be misled by the data newspapers may report about the volume of aid being given. A lot of it is self-serving. It's being spent on stuff from here still. Right? Pluses and minuses, as I mentioned. If you're going to be generous, why not get something out of it? Why not be able to sell it to your citizens saying, yeah, we're giving billions of dollars to those countries, but we're getting a lot more out of it. So you should be happy we're engaging in these aid activities. And the minus, of course, is it's not the most efficient way to spend the money. You can spend the money buying branded drugs from us, which costs more money and that helps our economy, or you can spend the money buying unbranded generic drugs from India, which will probably do more good in the long run because you can buy more of it, but it won't help us. What's more important? It's a values question. So much of this is about what your individual and social values turn out to be. So, DFAT, by the way, is what global affairs used to be called. It used to be called the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So from their website a couple of years ago, they announced that they were going to untie food aid. It's a big deal for them. Up until that point, all Canadian food aid was tied, meaning if there's a country experiencing a famine or some kind of food disaster, and if we gave them any kind of aid, it was tied, meaning they had to use that money to buy Canadian food. Right? There was a big long-term public outcry by development workers and international health people and ethicists who said that's completely unethical because you can spend that money locally better. You can buy culturally appropriate foods more appropriately. You can get local grain rather than buying Canadian grain that has to be transported. So they finally reneged and said, okay, from now on, all food aid given by Canada will be untied, meaning use that money as you will so long as it is food assistance. Then Engineers Without Borders has argued that tied aid raises the cost of goods and services by 30%. Okay? So yes, the argument in favor of tied aid is a political argument, meaning I can more easily sell the aid idea if I convince the citizenry you're getting something out of it. On the other hand, as a result of tying it to these geographic requirements, the price goes up almost 30%, which is outrageous. So here's a classic example of tying. Stephen Harper, a horrible, horrible man. He says proudly on the record, he was prioritizing aid for countries with Canadian mining interests. I've gone on the record several times saying mining is one of the most damaging enterprises, especially for indigenous populations. So the work I do in Guyana, we see a hell of a lot of damage done by Canadian mining companies. But Harper was prioritizing aid for countries for which Canadian mining companies had an active interest. Now, pluses and minuses. One could argue that this is evil. On its face is evil. You're saying, you know what, we're only sending you money because we want your minerals. We'll give you money if you open up your borders to our companies to come and mine. On the other hand, why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't Canadian citizens and the Canadian economy get something out of this? So it's two different ways of looking at it. And how you view this depends on your personal politics and your personal values. And again, Canadian aid money supports mining companies in development countries. I've personally seen this many, many times. It's annoying, but again, depends on your perspective. So, humanitarian aid. As I mentioned, humanitarian aid is easy to sell. Everyone agrees that if there's immediate suffering happening, a disaster, we should swoop in and be heroes. Okay, so the primary objective of humanitarian aid is to save life and alleviate suffering. So there's an earthquake happening, there are people clinging to dear life where their roofs have collapsed or something. We're going to show up and over the short term provide aid. Fantastic. The problem is it doesn't help prevent future crises. Development aid is there to prevent future crisis. With development aid, you can say, well, we're going to invest in people being wealthier and better educated so they build better houses that aren't earthquake vulnerable, whatever it might be. So if the nation that's being affected were more developed, it would not have suffered as much from the natural disaster as is doing so now. So those are the two arms of aid, humanitarian versus development. There's something called the Sphere Project. So the Sphere Project set a minimum set of standards for what humanitarian assistance should be. And these are some of the organizations that signed on to the Sphere Project. Tracy O'Sullivan in our school, she's her field of research is disaster aid, and she's probably the closest thing we have to an expert on the Sphere Project in this faculty. So you can talk to her about this if you care about it. But here are the NGOs that are part of the Sphere Project, and they have a handbook that has, again, the minimum standards of disaster response. You can get it from here. And they have essentially 3 fundamental principles that every organization should adhere to when engaging in humanitarian aid. And they are, of course, the right to life with dignity. It's not sufficient to be alive. You must have clothing and a roof and a job and food and all that stuff. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants. So think about Doctors Without Borders again. That's their entire reason for being, is we're going to show up and give disaster assistance to the citizens in the event of armed conflict, because the army takes care of their soldiers, no one takes care of the citizens. And this thing called, I never pronounced this right, non-refoulement, non-refoulement, I don't know what it is. Let's say refoulement for now. Okay, so what is this principle of non-refoulement? It's kind of like asylum. So what it is, it's a principle in law that says that you cannot return refugees to a place where their lives and freedoms are being threatened. Okay, so it's not quite the same as political asylum. So asylum is when an individual shows up at your border and says, I can't go back to my country because the government's trying to kill me because I was a dissident there. And if you send me back, I'd be committing murder. So this happens, right? It happens every day in the airport. Someone shows up at the airport, and I've seen it happen, and they get to the front of the line saying, I'm claiming political asylum. And what happens there is they're taken to the back room, and the Canadian government is actually quite nice to them. They give them a coffee and a meal, and an official is sent in by the government to interrogate them, to ask about the nature of their application, and they go through a process to determine whether or not we will grant them asylum. And asylum means they can live here and be protected by our government from the government that wishes to kill them. Okay, but with this non-refoulement, this is about large populations, huge refugee populations that maybe face not necessarily political entanglements and threats, but maybe physical entanglements and threats. So it forbids repatriation of people to a place where they will be subject to persecution or a life-threatening experience. So, by the way, international law isn't law. International law is kind of guidelines. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say so for sure, but that's my understanding. We do have a world court in The Hague, and so Canada, as a signatory to certain international laws, will send people to the World Court if other nations have said they're in violation of international law. But there's nothing in any nation's constitution that requires them to adhere to international laws. These are agreements between gentlemen around the world. So you will see many examples of this principle not being respected. Think of the Syrian refugees right now. Okay, so take it with a large grain of salt, in my opinion. So development aid, on the other hand, takes us back to World War II, which I have argued already is the birth of modern-day development in global health. And in this famous speech that Harry Truman gave at the end of World War II, he says, more than half the people of the world are living in conditions approaching misery, the food is inadequate, they're victims of disease, their economic life is primitive, their poverty is a handicap, and it's a threat both to them and to more prosperous areas. That's interesting. So Harry Truman is acknowledging that poverty affects the wealthy as well. And for the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and skill to relieve the suffering of these people. In other words, we have the wealth, the technology, the political acumen, and the organizational strength to actually do something about it. So that's when development starts. Important moment in history. So, as with the previous speech we talked about, these statements were given at the founding of NATO. Remember, NATO is the treaty organization that represents the West in the Cold War against the Warsaw Pact. This suggests that aid is linked to foreign policy agendas, including national security. All of this is tied in some way to military adventure or misadventure. So don't be surprised when you see that conflation happening in media and in political speeches. So here, look at these graphs here. This is from 2011, so the numbers have changed somewhat. This shows where the U.S. sends military assistance in either disbursements, how much money they actually spent out, or how much money they intend to give. So Afghanistan received the most money from the U.S., but most of that was in military aid as opposed to actual money. Right? So Israel, again, receives it's all military aid and so forth. So how to disentangle these numbers, it's unclear. It depends on the story you are trying to tell. So let us now critique aid. Because everybody in this room, we took this class because you care about helping the world. So we all, in principle, agree that aid is probably a good thing. We want to help the world, use our wealth and our skills and our ambition to help the world. Fantastic. But what are the criticisms? Well, the criticisms of intent and criticisms of action. Criticisms of intent. We never give it for reasons of pure altruism. Never is a strong word. We see suffering in an earthquake or a tsunami or something. We say, okay, we want to help those people. That's altruism. On the other hand, as I've noted, a lot of aid is given for political leverage. I will forgive $1 billion of Egyptian debt as a way to encourage their march to democracy. I will give money to this country here because they've got minerals that my mining companies want, and this opens the door for their adventures. So beware of the verbiage that says we are such great and grand people that we are giving all this money because we're just good. Almost never happens. It's often given as a means of supporting an ally, like Egypt, for example. They move towards democracy. We support them for doing so. Often gives means to influence the political process. Egypt, another obvious example. Aid by capitalistic organizations meant to open up new markets. We talked about that last class. Okay. Then we have criticisms of effectiveness. This is more an easy sell. The previous slide was about the politics and the philosophy. Now is it actually working? So, as I've shown in the first couple of slides, those newspaper clips, a lot of the money is sometimes absorbed by the process of transference. So in other words, it's stolen by corrupt officials. It's stolen on both ends. It's stolen by people on this side sending the money, and it's stolen people on that end receiving the money. And I say it's stolen in quotation marks because is it really stealing? Right? If it goes through a non-illegal process of having money set aside to pay overpaid consultants right here to vet the documents and shit, is that stealing? Yeah, probably. But that's how it stays here. So a lot of aid is absorbed by administration. You will probably read a lot about the Red Cross being an inefficient organization. We give them hundreds of millions of dollars to respond to a crisis, but a fraction of that money ends up on the ground. I'm a great defender of the Red Cross. They are inefficient. Their administration just eats up a lot of money because they have a lot of people to pay. They've got a lot of workers, a lot of overhead. That's the nature of the game. There is no evaluation process. I mentioned this before. We do evaluation very, very poorly. And are we getting a good return on investment? Meaning, if this nation is going to give 0.7% of its wealth to the developing world, what are we getting out of it? People in this room probably say we shouldn't get anything out of it. That should be the goodness of our hearts for giving this money away. But others would argue, no, we should get something out of it. That something might be political stability. It might be a safer world. It might be a trading partner. It might be fewer refugees. Who knows? So, other people criticize aid as being ideologically driven. So, so far I've talked a lot about neoliberal policies. A lot of aid is tied to capitalism. So we will spend a lot of money on making sure markets are healthy or the businesses are thriving. And maybe that's a good thing, I'm not sure, but that's definitely a reliance on a free market ideology. As I mentioned, the U.S. gives a lot of money through private donation, and that goes through churches. That's faith-based. Yeah?
I don't know, this is silly, but when you promote democracy in a country, you also promote capitalism?
One could argue that capitalism and democracy are linked. Some people have argued that. I'm not going to argue that because I don't really fully understand the process that well. It's not my field of expertise. But a modern democracy is a capitalist democracy. It's possible to have capitalist states that aren't democracies. Singapore comes to mind. Singapore is pretty much, an authoritarian state, but they're a strong, they have a strong market economy as well. So it's more complicated than that. But in general, yes, around the world, the best market states are in fact democracies. So it's a roundabout way of not answering your question. So. Well, I mean, there was a strong desire to see Egypt enter the fold of democratic nations. So, because Egypt is a wealthy nation and they're strategically well placed, so it's important that they remain stable. So when the United States forgave their billion-dollar debt, they had several things in mind. Primary among them was probably stability. We don't want them collapsing into a failed state because they're not a bulwark against other potential terror threats there. But also, Egypt has traditionally been a strong trading partner for the West, and it's important that be maintained by these people who are giving money. So debt is another problem. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the times aid is given in the form of debt. I'm not giving you money, I'm giving you a loan. So I'm prolonging this debt crisis, which is not cool. The Marshall Plan we talked about briefly. The Marshall Plan was the post-World War II plan to remake Europe. And in many ways, it was a political contest between the West and the East, so the Americans and the Soviets, to see who could develop Europe better and faster in ways that are meaningful. So the Marshall Plan was for Western Europe. So that's why Germany and France and Italy became rapidly powerful economies. East Germany, Yugoslavia did not because they were part of the Soviet bloc. Now the true desire in funding the Marshall Plan was for these states to be strong to fend off communism. That was their desire. What they ended up with was very strong Western Europe. However, one could argue that the reason for the Marshall Plan was not altruistic. It wasn't we have to help these people. It was we need to control Western Europe so that the Soviets don't roll over them and come after us afterwards. We could also argue that they weren't effective, since the countries with the biggest investments, here Britain, Sweden, and Greece, actually saw the least growth, or the ones with the least investment, Austria and Germany, saw the most growth. So maybe they're going to grow anyway. Hard to say. This is James Shikwati. He's an economist, and he's a libertarian. So libertarians believe in a lot of free market ideas, individual choice, et cetera, and they believe that the best way to do everything is to increase trade. So he argues that aid is damaging, since in almost all cases of bilateral aid, the money goes to corrupt leaders, and you cannot trust corrupt leaders to do the job of dispersing the funds effectively. And in fact, he would argue that if you're giving these corrupt leaders money, you are in fact propping up their dictatorial aspirations and slowing the path to true democracy. So he would argue that we should not be doing this. A common criticism, which is a real thing, we'll talk more about this in the ethics lecture, is that food aid is one of the worst things you can do. So if you dump free food in a famine area, you're actually killing the local food economy. So let's say we're a famine-stricken nation. Even famine-struck nations are producing some food, just not a lot of it. So the farmers here are barely clinging on, producing what they can, but selling it to market and staying alive. Now suddenly, someone shows up and gives all this free food. Who's going to buy food from the handful of farmers still making? Nobody will. So they'll go out of business. Now suddenly there's this prolonged dependence on the foreigners because there is no more indigenous food production. It's real. We see this all the time. So he uses this as an example to say that aid, poorly thought out, can be damaging. Dambisa Moyo is a famous economist, and she was the second person to follow me on Twitter. It's really weird. The first was the Israeli embassy, and both of these just creep me out. I'm not sure why either one of them is following me. And neither one follows me now, so I don't know what happened there. But she was also a bit right of center as well, and she was advocating that all aid to Africa must end. And she said argue for trade improvement. So that's a common theme that the right of center economists would argue. You can watch her statements on this YouTube clip if you want. Jeff Sachs, I mentioned him before. Jeff Sachs is a famous economist who's the father pretty much of modern development economics, and he was also involved in recreating the Russian economy after the fall of the Soviet Union during the shock therapy years. So shock therapy was their approach to sort of shock the Russian economy back into a democratic state. Didn't work. So but Jeff Sachs has remade himself into some great anti-poverty guru, and he argues that Africa's governance is poor because Africa is poor. In other words, Shikwati says you can't give them money to corrupt dictators because they'll waste it. Sachs is saying they'll waste it because they're poor. If they were rich, they'd have better leadership. They wouldn't have to worry about this. So in other words, we should actually increase development, and that will allow them to become more democratic and more responsible, and in the long term allow them to process that money better. So, in other words, we overwhelm poverty with serious aid. So you can watch him here as well. So there's William Easterly. So Bill Easterly is another American economist, and he responds to Sachs. You can read this here. And if you're really feeling dorky, you can read economists battling online. That's what I do. It's kind of interesting, right? And so we can read the Sachs debates with Easterly here. There was a famous, by famous I mean famous, and like 100 people around the world who watched this carefully back in the day. So he'll argue poverty never has been ended and never will be ended by foreign experts or foreign aid. In other words, development people will not do the job. We have to rely on democracy and free markets. That's an ideology. That's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with ideological arguments for and against development aid. You can read their original articles here and there. Okay, so why do we have aid? Is it for altruistic purposes? We want to do good in the world. Rarely have I seen it done for those reasons. Again, maybe for disasters, when the common person says, we got to help those starving kids over there. Fantastic. But that's not why the world mobilizes. Is it for strategic purposes? More commonly so. So we want to develop foreign markets for our products. We want to bribe foreign governments to do certain things. What things? Usually bulk works against our enemies. Reward our friends. We want to prevent the creation of refugees. Well, this is a really powerful argument these days for development. And it finds a sympathetic ear in the modern conservative government. If you're arguing against financially conservative people for justification to spend money abroad, you say, well, if we develop those nations, they are less likely to fall apart, less likely to produce refugees, less likely to produce terrorists. Therefore, it's an investment in our own safety. Is it for image purposes? They don't look cheap, right? Or domestic purposes. A big part of it is this, right? So international development is an industry that employs a lot of people, myself including. So we have to remain well paid and in business. So this shows us foreign aid per capita from 2007. The numbers haven't changed that much. The number one giver is always a Scandinavian country in the top 5 or so. Luxembourg, sometimes Denmark, right? They give almost $500 per capita. Well, maybe per capita isn't the right way to do it. Maybe we should look at foreign aid per GDP unit. Well, same thing happens here. Just go back for a second. Where's USA? They're down 18. Canada's number 12. If we do it per GDP, where's USA? They're number 21. Where's Canada? Number 12 again. Okay, so we're always in the middle of the pack. As I mentioned, the United States is the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. They're also the world's largest bilateral donor. They give the most money en masse. As a per capita investment is very, very low. As a per GDP unit investment is very, very low. But it depends on how you look at it. They are by far the most important giving nation in the world, despite the fact they take a lot of shit from us for having a very low per capita giving. But they give a lot of that money as well in military assistance, which can be problematic. There's something called the Commitment to Development Index, the CDI. I'm big on indicators. How do we measure nations' commitment to giving money? So the CDI ranks the world's richest countries, OECD nations, in terms of how dedicated they are to assisting other countries. And what they've done is they've created a combined score that looks at trade, investment, migration, how people are going to move around. They're committed to environmental sustainability, personal security, and technology. And this is what they find. Unsurprisingly, Scandinavian countries are on top in terms of being the most committed to international development. Canada is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 again. Look at that. So it seems like we're measuring the same thing. ODA per capita, ODA per GDP, CDI always puts Canada in the 12th place. The United States in the top 20 as well. Okay. Same thing. We moved down 15 a couple years ago. Right. Let's talk about the 0.7% commitment now. Something that every Canadian student should be aware of. Our former Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, who, did he win the Nobel Prize? I always confuse Pearson and Diefenbaker. One of them won the Nobel Prize. Someone will look this up and tell me. But Pearson wrote a report for the World Bank back in the 60s where he computed and suggested that if every wealthy nation, OECD nations, gave 0.7% of their GNI, gross national income, as ODA, ODA again is the official amount of money we give. 0.7% given by all the wealthy nations is more than sufficient to pay for all the anti-poverty programs the world needs. Right? The world was so impressed by this computation that in 1970 there was a UN resolution that says that we must all strive towards a 0.7% commitment. It's called that, the 0.7% commitment. So a Canadian put this into international law, and that's what we all strive for. So the Canadian government aimed for our goal to be reached by 1975, at the very least by 1980. Did you think we got there? Well, so by the turn of the century, the average nation was donating 0.47%, so just over half of the 0.7% commitment. We're donating less than half of our commitment, even though it was our idea. And our highest number was in 75, we gave 0.53%. So these are the nations that met their commitment. I think the UK is on that list now, because the UK, they made a concerted effort a couple years ago to hit that mark. This is how it looks. So from 2004. So I think recently the UK joined the ranks. Only Scandinavian countries have made it above the 0.7%. Canada's over here. We're well below. The USA isn't even trying. And there we have it. Okay. 2013 looks like this. UK, close. Yeah, well. Okay. Well, same thing. Same thing. So Jeff Sachs came to Ottawa a few years ago, and he gave the commencement address at Carleton. And I found it very interesting because he talked about the 0.7% commitment. And he says that we need to reach it because it was our idea. And if we're not doing it, then why should anybody else do it? So every year, a student group on campus usually takes this as a reason to run to Parliament and complain about stuff. It's a good thing to build a campaign around if you're an activist. And every year it happens. Why aren't we meeting our 0.7% commitments? And maybe one day we will. So I will stop there. Thank you very much. I will see you on Thursday.